Hello, and welcome to the 7th part of the Ancient Roman Iceberg. If you haven't seen the previous parts, I would definitely recommend you go check those out first, as they cover some things that we're going to get deeper into in this episode. Anyways, let's get into the video. We start today with the 8th tier in our iceberg. Roman expeditions refer to several different expeditions and explorations into Sub-Saharan Africa undertaken by various Roman emperors, private citizens, and commercial interests. By the 1st century BCE, Romans had been present in North Africa for centuries. Carthage had been conquered in the previous century, while the kingdoms of Numidia and Cyrenaica were either full vassal kingdoms of Rome or falling further and further under Rome's influence. However, Rome's influence had been contained by one of Earth's greatest natural barriers, the Sahara Desert. The Sahara is the largest hot desert in the world. It stretches from one end of Africa to the other, and there is a reason the Sahara has served as the unofficial dividing line in Africa for centuries. It's nearly completely inhospitable, with temperatures regularly reaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sand itself reaching temperatures over 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Even today, with all the great technological marvels the world has developed, the Sahara is estimated to only contain roughly 2.5 million people, which is about 0.4 people per square mile. To give you a little bit of perspective, the Sahara is roughly 3.5 million square miles. That's about 400,000 square miles larger than the contiguous United States. But the population of the contiguous United States is 328 million, a density of 111 people per square mile. If we add in Alaska and Hawaii, the size of the United States jumps to about 3.7 million square miles, which is slightly larger than the Sahara. And the population jumps from 328 million to about 331 million, which is a density of 96 people per square mile. I say all this in the hope of showing you just how inhospitable and uninhabited the desert is today. In the time of the Romans, those numbers would have been even lower. I will quickly note here that this does not, contrary to popular belief, mean that the Sahara was without a population, or even great civilizations during history. Far from it. Cultures such as the Kiphians and the Tenarians all survived and even thrived in the Sahara. To be honest, there is a rich history here that one day I would love to examine in more detail, but it is important to counter the modern day notion of Sub-Saharan Africa and Saharan Africa as an area without great civilizations, cultures, social organizations, and so on. I will leave some resources that talk a bit more about some of the cultures in the description, but I think it's important to realize that there were people in the Sahara, and there were even civilizations in the Sahara at the time of the Romans. They were simply few and far in between. The Romans likely first learned about the area south of the Sahara from men like Hanno the Navigator, a Carthaginian who sailed around the western coast of Africa. Hanno certainly made it to southern Morocco, but many historians claim he may have even reached modern-day Gabon. Pliny the Elder and Arrian, two Roman historians of the period, both mention Hanno in their works. This indicates that the Romans at least believed that something was beyond the Great Sea of Sand. Further, we know that Rome traded with the kingdoms of Eritrea, northern Africa, and Ethiopia, all of which we know traded with kingdoms deeper into Africa's interior. It's likely then that stories of gold and spices easily reached Roman ears from their traders in kingdoms like Aksum and Ethiopia. This all eventually motivated the Romans to seek out those kingdoms. There are 5 main explorations that we know of. Some of these are near universally agreed upon to have taken place, while others are, shall we say, doubted, or at least viewed with more skepticism. So let's quickly take a look at each expedition. The first expedition we have a record of is one led by Cornelius Balbus in 20 or 19 BCE. We are told by Pliny the Elder that Balbus planned to conquer. He took with him a force of infantry and swapped the normal horses and mules for camels, probably a smart move considering just where he was looking to go. Balbus seems to have been inspired to invade by various Roman merchants in the area around modern-day Libya. It was an area in which a local group had established a fairly influential kingdom. These people, called the Garamantes, had settled in the area of Libya by at least 1000 BCE, and had established themselves as a kingdom on the edge of the Sahara. We know that they engaged in raids on Roman coastal towns, and we know that some Roman trade routes were either raided by the Garamantes or were extorted for protection, as the caravans made their way to their destinations. This is seemingly the reason given by Pliny to motivate Balbus to launch his expedition, but there is some evidence that the Garamantes also acted as a sort of intermediary between the Romans and Sub-Saharan Africa, something that would have almost certainly attracted Roman attention. I would venture to guess that the real reason for Balbus's expedition is likely a mixture of the two. In any case, Balbus first marched to the Garamantes' capital of Galmara. Here he easily conquered the city, and forced the Garamantes to agree to stop extorting Roman trade, and we are told that he occupied some mercantile routes for the advantage of the Romans. It's a little unclear what exactly this means, but it probably means that the Romans took over, or at least were guaranteed access to local trade routes that the Garamantes had excluded them from. From here, the expedition is a little harder to follow. We know that Balbus, likely of his own accord, sent some of his men to explore the, quote, land of lions, which probably referred to the land beyond the Hagar Mountains in modern-day Algeria. These men apparently followed the caravans on their trade routes, and returned with maps, guides, and likely first-hand accounts of the region. We know that Balbus came to the city of Cadamus, known today as Gadamus, which at the time was a large oasis and likely served as a checkpoint for various trade routes in and out of the Sahara. Pliny tells us that he continued on, and apparently even reached a, quote, large body of water, which was probably the Niger River. There is evidence of Roman coins in the region. However, it's frankly hard to say how accurate this telling by Pliny is. We can be fairly certain that Balbus did move against the Garamantes, but did he journey all the way to the Niger River? Well, despite the evidence of Roman coins, it's kind of a toss-up among modern historians. It is certainly possible that Balbus could make it to the Niger River. Groups in the Sahara had been making that trip for centuries at this point. But Balbus was also only a proconsul for a year, and upon him leaving office, his authority to conduct such an expedition would have been gone, and his men would have been duty-bound to either stay in place or return to Rome to receive a new commander. It's really hard to say how true this account is, so for now, let's count this one as possible, but not unquestionable. The second expedition occurred just a few decades later, in 41 AD. This expedition was led by Suetonius Paulus. Yes, you might recognize that name if you watched the last episode, as this guy was the guy who fought Boudicca back in Britain. He really gets around, doesn't he? In any case, in 40 AD, Suetonius was appointed as governor of Mauritania, an area roughly equating to modern-day northern Morocco. At around the same time, a man named Adaemon launched a revolt against Roman occupation. Adaemon was likely a Berber, the peoples native to the region. He had been a loyal slave to the King Ptolemy of Mauritania. Ptolemy was a client of the Roman state, but had been murdered under strange circumstances while in Rome, likely on the orders of the Roman Emperor Caligula. Adaemon likely launched this rebellion as a response. We don't know how many locals joined him, but it was seemingly a decent portion, as it required the attention of Suetonius, a noted Roman general of the time, and Gnaeus Hositus Geta, again a noted Roman general. The two led a apparently brutal campaign that destroyed a number of the cities in the region and resulted in the deaths of a, quote, large number of Berbers. In any case, the war is not really what we're here to talk about. Instead, we are here to talk about Suetonius' route during the war. During the war, Suetonius was the first Roman to lead an army across the Atlas Mountains, a range that had served as the Roman frontier since they came into control of the area in around 33 BCE. Pliny actually gives us his first-hand account in his book, The Natural History. Here he says that Suetonius not only summited the mountains, but also crossed to the foot of the mountains on the other side. I'll put the full quote up on the screen, but what we really want to focus on is the last sentence of the quote, where Pliny tells us, quote, he proceeded some distance beyond it, as far as a river which bears the name of Gare. We don't know what the river Gare is, although the two most popular candidates are the Niger River or the Senegal River, although some historians actually suggest that Suetonius visited both, in that he at first came to the Gare River and then to the Senegal River. There is some evidence that it would be the Niger River though, because in Berber there is actually a phrase called the Ger en Ger, meaning river of rivers. So perhaps Ger en Ger was translated to the river Ger, meaning the Niger River. But frankly, we just don't know for sure. Again, Roman coins and artifacts have been discovered in both regions, especially in the area of Aktrich, which I probably butchered that, which is a small city in western Mauritania and only a few hundred miles from the Senegal River. And of course we've already mentioned some areas along the Niger River. This expedition does seem to be more accepted among modern historians. Firstly, it's almost certainly true that the man crossed the Atlas Mountains. The war probably forced him to do so, as Adaemon and the locals would have simply retreated into the mountains if/when they faced defeat. His expedition past the mountains is probably more accepted simply due to the fact that he was a contemporary of Pliny the Elder. In fact, Pliny literally quotes the man. This, combined with the fact that the artifacts found in Avenged are seemingly from the correct time period, it seems almost certain that Suetonius at least made it to the area around Avenged, and likely to the Senegal River. I would fairly safely say that we can consider this expedition likely true. Our next expedition was led by a name named Septimus Flaccus. We know comparatively much less about this expedition, or really expeditions when you compare them to our previous two. But we do know that Septimus was a Roman general, who sometime in the 1st century AD apparently led a Roman expedition to the Lake of Hippopotamus. This was the name given by Ptolemy, one of the main geographers of the time, to Lake Chad. This expedition almost certainly occurred before 90 AD, as it was then that Ptolemy would name the lake as such, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. Septimus journeyed through the lands of, and was likely led by, the Garamantes. It apparently took 3 months to travel to the lake. But one journey wasn't enough for Septimus, as Ptolemy tells us that he journeyed to the region again in 50 AD, but this time Septimus was leading a campaign against some unnamed nomadic raiders who had attacked the Roman city of Leptis Magna. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of these rivers, as quite frankly I will almost certainly butcher them, but I'll list them on the screen in front of you. Each of these rivers fed into Lake Chad, and Lake Chad was likely the final destination of this second expedition. Ptolemy also tells us that just a few decades later, another Roman, named Julius Maternus, would also lead an expedition into the same region. Julius would apparently travel with the king of the Garamantes, and eventually come to these two rivers, which I again won't try to pronounce as I will easily butcher them. It was said that Julius returned to Rome with a rhinoceros with 2 horns. This actually lines up with some other historical evidence that we have, as it was under Domitian, who would have been ruling at the time, that the Colosseum first displayed a rhino, which may have been the one that Julius brought back to Rome. Some historians postulate that Julius was actually a Roman diplomat that was sent to the king of the Garamantes to improve trading relations, and followed the king while he campaigned against rebellious subjects, or against other native peoples. And that's really all that we have on these 2 expeditions. I think it's pretty likely the journey of Julius was at least partly accurate. The appearance of a rhino in the Colosseum is simply too much of a coincidence, and likely points towards at least some sort of expedition by Julius. The expedition of Septimus is one of these where I think we simply lack enough evidence to really say one way or the other. So we'll chalk these up to true on behalf of Julius, and maybe on behalf of Septimus. Our next expedition comes from a man named Valerius Festus. Pliny tells us that in 70 AD, Festus led an expedition to follow the route that Balbus had followed nearly 90 years earlier. We are told that Festus made it to the Air Mountains, and even as far as the Gadufawa Plain, and eventually even made it to the famous city of Timbuktu and the Niger River. And that's really about it. I again think that this one is a maybe, as we simply lack the information to decide one way or the other. So, what does this all mean in the grand scheme of things? Well, I think it's pretty clear that Rome tried, and likely even succeeded in crossing the Sahara Desert. Of course, they likely never established any sort of permanent or even semi-permanent outpost, or even a trading post in the area. The natural challenge of the Sahara simply meant that such an outpost couldn't be secured, supplied, or even constantly replenished by the Romans without significant investment and effort. 2 things that Rome needed in much more pressing regions, like Germania and Britain, for instance. Instead, it's much more likely that these expeditions were an attempt to find new sources of gold and other important trade goods, something that the Romans likely did find. However, the cost and effort needed to secure those goods was simply too much, and so Rome never crossed the Sahara in force. Instead, they continued to rely on groups like the Garamantes to be a sort of middleman, something we can see in the continued existence of that kingdom into later centuries. But I don't think it's crazy to say that multiple Romans at least stepped foot in the areas around the Niger and Senegal rivers, and even Lake Chad. These expeditions likely furthered trading relations with the Garamantes, and probably explains why we find Roman coins and artifacts in these regions. I think we could certainly debate the significance and the depth of these interactions, but I don't think we can debate that they actually happened, and just that fact alone is important. It shows that not only Rome knew more about the world than we thought just a few centuries ago, but also that civilizations of Sub-Saharan Africa were not only thriving, but rich and interesting enough for what was arguably the most powerful civilization in the world at the time to interact with. Something which I think challenges the conventional view on the area. This area of scholarship is rapidly developing, and I think we'll be in for some interesting discoveries over the next few decades. This one is pretty simple. Essentially, this comes from some historical evidence that shows that Mehmed II, after conquering Constantinople, journeyed to the ruins of Troy and boasted that he had avenged the city by conquering the Greeks. The idea being that the Turks, an Anatolian peoples, avenged the Trojans, another Anatolian peoples, by throwing the Greeks, the Byzantines, out of the region. And to be fair, he kind of has a bit of a point. The Byzantines were certainly Greek by this point, and the Turks were technically an Anatolian people. So, I guess in a roundabout way, they did avenge the Trojans. Of course, in actuality, it's still debated just who the Trojans were. Some say they were Greek, some say Hittite, and some say a completely separate people. Add to this the fact that the Turks originated in Central Asia and had only been inhabiting Anatolia for roughly 400 years now, and you get a bit of a different picture. But it's still pretty interesting to think of Mehmed proudly proclaiming that he had avenged Troy, and it really makes me wonder just how different history would be if his successors had carried the same interest in Troy and recreating Rome that Mehmed had. The quote, "I have made but one mistake," refers to the alleged last words of the Roman Emperor Titus, who ruled from 79 to 81 AD. Titus was the heir to Vespasian, his father, who had emerged as the victor during the year of the Four Emperors. And he was actually the first Roman emperor to succeed his biological father on the throne. He died during a journey to Sabine territories, where he was said to have uttered his famous last words. It's also said that he was going to continue the sentence before he, died. First, let me just say that most of the time, save for some extreme circumstances, last words are almost never some glorious statement or some incredible reflection on a life well lived. Instead, they normally range from something fairly mundane, like, "Man, my chest kinda hurts," to various screams or even a slight whimper. To get serious and kind of morbid, death is normally not pretty, and this was especially true for the period. It's likely that Titus didn't actually say, "I have made but one mistake," right before he died. Instead, it's much more likely that those around him made it up, or that he either instructed them to say so, or he wrote the words down shortly before his death. But for the sake of the video, let's just assume he did actually say those words. First of all, seriously impressive to only have one mistake, and secondly, what did he mean, and what was the mistake? Well, there are some grand historical theories, ranging from affairs with Domitia Longia, the wife of his younger brother Domitian, to him not killing Domitian when he had the chance. This last theory mostly came about from the rumors that Domitian had been plotting the overthrow of Titus for years, and that Domitian even had some hand in his death. We do know that the two did not have much love for each other, and Domitian showed little reaction to Titus's death, and actually hurriedly returned to Rome to claim the emperorship. But truly, this could have referred to any event during Titus's life. Maybe he regretted not being able to stop the fire in Rome during the year 80. This fire would go on to burn for 3 days and nights, and massive parts of the city were destroyed, while many Romans died in the capital. Maybe he regretted being emperor at all. Perhaps he wished he had become co-emperor with his brother, or maybe even remained as a top military commander and relinquished political power to someone else. The point here is that everyone has regrets, and I would imagine a Roman emperor likely had more than the average person. So, in the end, we will never be able to know just what Titus was referring to. But if you ask me, those are some pretty awesome last words for history to ascribe to you. Maybe I should start working on my last words before I end up with something stupid like, "Hey, does anyone else think it smells like burnt toast in here?" Romans in Ireland refers to the idea that Rome had some sort of presence in Ireland, or Hibernia as they called it. This, of course, is most heavily associated with Agricola, someone we talked about last time, but the relations between the people of Ireland and Rome go back much further. It's almost certain that Rome and Ireland were trading with one another by the time of Claudius's invasion of southern Britain in 43. Ptolemy was also able to correctly identify the locations of coastal settlements and even the lands of some native Irish peoples, something that would have only been possible with either fairly extensive trading relations or some sort of Roman expedition to the island. We also find many Roman archaeological objects all across Ireland, including coins, jewelry, and other such items. But, truthfully, this is probably the extent of Roman presence in Ireland. There is no archaeological evidence that Agricola actually invaded the area, and no evidence that any other Roman did either. There is some literary evidence that Rome might have at least stepped foot on the island, with Juvenal, a Roman poet, claiming that, quote, arms had been taken beyond the shores of Hibernia, end quote. But it's also unclear what exactly this means. It could mean that Rome had conducted a military expedition, or maybe Rome had simply supplied some Irish army with arms to conduct their own campaign. Or maybe he simply misidentified Ireland, and the arms actually went to Caledonia, or somewhere similar. We will probably never know for sure. For now though, our evidence point towards the Romans maintaining a healthy trade relationship with the Irish, but not much else. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus was a Roman general and statesman who was sadly overshadowed in history by the, frankly, greater men around him. Our Lepidus was the son of another Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Yeah, they weren't all that creative with names. Lepidus Sr. had been a vocal opponent of Sulla and the Optimates faction within the Roman government, even briefly leading a failed rebellion against them and the Roman government in 78 BCE. This didn't seem to affect Lepidus Jr. all that much though. He joined the College of Pontiffs at a young age, and eventually became one of Julius Caesar's most fervent supporters. He was the last interrex of the Republic in 52 BCE. He was then appointed praetor in 49 BCE, and was even left in charge of Rome while Caesar went to defeat Pompey in Greece. Lepidus was instrumental in securing the appointment of Caesar to the post of dictator, and was rewarded with an appointment to pro-praetor of Hispania Citerior. During his time in Spain, Lepidus crushed a revolt of the neighboring governor of Hispania Ulterior, and was even granted a triumph for his victory. In 46, he was rewarded with a consulship, and was even made Magister Equitum, or Master of the Horse, to Caesar himself, essentially making him second in command in Rome. This would actually be the last time that the Master of the Horse would hold military command, and really the last time that the office would be used in its original form. Apparently Lepidus had done a good enough job, as he was again appointed Master of the Horse in 44 when the Senate declared Caesar dictator for life. Of course, this would end just a month later, with the assassination of Caesar on March 15th, 44 BCE. Lepidus was actually one of the first members of the Roman government to respond to the assassination. He ordered troops to the Campus Martius, and at first intended to use those troops to punish Caesar's killers. However, he was talked out of it by Mark Antony, but it seemed that Lepidus was truly calling the shots at this moment. The troops responded to his command, and if he wished it, then they would have painted the Senate House red with blood. Okay, maybe that's a bit dramatic, but Lepidus certainly stepped into the vacuum left by Caesar's death, which was his right as Master of the Horse after all. Lepidus and Antony would both speak to the Senate the next day, where they would agree to amnesty for the senators in exchange for the two men keeping their offices and the reforms of Caesar staying in place. With no new dictator, Lepidus's position as Master of the Horse was basically useless, and so Lepidus was appointed Pontifex Maximus, the last person to hold the title under the Republic. You can probably see a theme here. Lepidus was really the last person to hold quite a few positions under the Republic. Following this, Lepidus would be sent to negotiate an agreement with the Boat King Sextus Pompey, the last surviving son of Pompey the Great. Following an agreement, the Senate would vote to give him his own Thanksgiving festival for the year, and actually give him the command of Hispania and Gallia Narbonensis. Lepidus would later enter into a political alliance with Antony, after the latter pissed the Roman Senate off by attempting to take command of Gaul from Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's killers, who had been sort of exiled from Rome itself. It would be around the same time that Octavian entered the picture. The three men would come to an agreement, and together form the Second Triumvirate. With this agreement, the Republic was well and truly dying. The consuls were put to the side in favor of direct rule by the three men. I'm not going to go too deep into the civil war that would follow, as quite simply Lepidus didn't play all that much of a role, but he agreed to hand control of several of his legions over to Antony and Octavian, and in exchange, he was confirmed as the ruler of Hispania and Gallia Narbonensis, and confirmed as Pontifex Maximus. He would also be given the position of consul, and would be the person to remain in Rome while Octavian and Antony continued the war in the east. Frankly, it was this move that doomed Lepidus to be a subsidiary in the Triumvirate. Not only did he give up military power in the form of several legions, but He also gave up the public relations boost that being the conquering hero gave Antony and Octavian following their victories. Antony and Octavian were given all the glory, while Lepidus remained back in Rome. Lepidus would see Octavian usurp his provinces of Hispania and Gallia Narbonensis just a few years later, with the Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BCE. In this treaty, Lepidus was given Africa and Numidia. Yeah, a bit of a downfall. Eventually, Lepidus would come to be more of a hindrance than a help to Octavian, and Lepidus would eventually see his legions defect to Octavian on the island of Sicily after a dispute over the island. Octavian would strip him of all his offices save for that of Pontifex Maximus, and really after this Lepidus faded from the public eye. His son would actually be executed for conspiring to assassinate Octavian, but he himself would be left alone. In fact, really the only thing he did in the last few years of his life was periodically return to Rome to vote in the Senate. It's said that Octavian, now Augustus, would always force Lepidus to vote last, an act that was seen as belittling. Lepidus would die in 13 BCE, and Augustus would finally take his last position, Pontifex Maximus, from him. While I think a lot of contemporary Romans viewed Lepidus as weak or incompetent, I really think that Lepidus was simply dealt a bad hand in life and made a few bad decisions. He was surrounded by men who were simply destined to be greater than him. Julius Caesar, Octavian, Mark Antony, Cicero, the list goes on and on. These men were simply titans of Roman history. They were all supremely gifted, and simply outclassed Lepidus in most regards. And yet, Lepidus still did very well for himself. Let us not forget that for a moment it was Lepidus who held much of the power in Rome after Caesar's death. It was Lepidus who was second in command of Rome during Caesar's reign, and it was Lepidus who supplied much of the manpower needed for Antony and Octavian to triumph. In the end, though, Lepidus made two main mistakes. First, he gave in to the Senate during the time after Caesar's death, and second, he gave up too much military power to Octavian and Antony. One wonders how differently history would look upon Lepidus if he had punished those that assassinated Caesar that night. What if it had been Lepidus who led the Roman armies against Caesar's assassins in the Civil War? We will never be able to say, but I think that Lepidus is often overshadowed by those around him, and it's really a shame as Lepidus was a great Roman and a man who deserves to be remembered. The 12 Tables were the first written form of Roman law. They were promulgated in 449 BCE and displayed in the Roman Forum. The tables laid out the rights and duties of a Roman citizen and formed the basis of Roman law for centuries. I've already made a video examining the tables in more detail, but I'll quickly go over them here, but check out that video if you want more information. Each table dealt with a specific aspect of Roman life. You can see each table in their relevant area on the screen in front of you. The tables touched on everything, from trials and courts to judgments to the rights of men and women, and even to the sacred laws of the gods themselves. I cannot possibly go over each table here, as quite simply we would be here for far too long. Instead, I will say that the 12 Tables might be the most influential pieces of writing in Rome's history. Today, we really fail to understand just how big of a deal it is that we can find written law with just a simple Google search, or a simple trip to the library. At this point in history, law was almost exclusively known and understood by an upper class. In the case of Rome, it was typically the priest, or perhaps the Senate. That opens up an easy lane for corruption and unequal treatment under the law. The 12 Tables, though, completely changed all of that. For the first time in Roman history, a citizen could simply walk to the forum and read exactly what rights they held, how they would be treated in a court, their rights in that court, and what punishment they might receive. It was frankly revolutionary. The tables would also go on to influence later law codes. The laws of Justinian, for example, were heavily influenced by the 12 Tables. Even today's system of law in the United States was influenced by the tables. James Madison used it as a resource in crafting the Bill of Rights. Hell, basically all of common or civil law can trace its origins back to the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables were one of Rome's most important writings. They greatly influenced Roman history, and frankly history as a whole, for millennia afterwards. They revolutionized how Romans interacted with their state, and even today, their influence can still be felt all across the Western world. And that is where we will pause our examination for today. I hope I've piqued your interest into some new aspect of Roman history, and join me next time as we continue to dig deeper into the depths of Roman history. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. Definitely let me know if any of these topics in particular has struck your fancy, and I may add it to the list to cover more in depth in the future. My hope is to finish this series in one more video, and then upload a supercut. I'll admit that I did not mean for this series to stretch on this long, but hey, that's life. If you have any questions or comments on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.